We are almost at the end of our school year. It's April, and a lot of people will finish up in May or June, so some of you may be kind of wrapping things up, whereas others of you school year round, and you might take a short break, but then you're gonna jump right back in. So yeah, so let's go ahead and jump right in to today's topic. So I went into my archives and I pulled out a few things to share with you. So I am a firm believer that we are homeschooling so that we are spending time with our kids, and we want to be the primary influence in our kids' lives, and we want to be involved and engaged in all that they are doing. But we also need to start teaching them how to work on their own and how to work independently. So when do you start doing that? Well, I believe that each child is going to be different, and depending on your kids' needs, some might be able to be more independent earlier, and some may need you a little longer. So really, there is no right answer. You have to determine that yourself. But I'm going to give you some ideas of how you can start doing that. So when they're very, very small, preschool, kindergarten, they really do kind of require one-on-one time, almost the entire time. That there's just not a lot of time between you explaining what they need to do and they do it. So you need to be there to explain, re-explain, redirect, point, all those kinds of things. But as they start to get a little older, first grade, second grade, third grade, and they're becoming independent readers, fluent readers, they can now read the math directions for themselves. They don't need you to read it. They can read the handwriting directions for themselves. They don't need you. So as they become more proficient, you will see that they will be able to do more things independently. So I went into my archives and I found I had created a checklist for my daughter, and I think this was around third grade. I can tell just by some of the things that were on here. We were in a co-op at the time, and so she was doing some things for the co-op that we weren't doing with our Sonlight stuff. And also I had added Italian, because I speak Italian and I wanted my kids to learn, and piano, because we were doing we were taking piano lessons. So really all I did was create a checklist in kind of a fun font, kind of big, and I put it in a page protector. And this way she could work off of this list. I did put it pretty much in the order that I wanted us to go in. But if she was ready to move on and do something else, and I wasn't ready because I was working with her brother, so if Annie was in third grade, Timothy was in fifth grade. So if I was working with Timothy on something and I needed her to be able to do something independently, I would say, look at your list and see what you can do on your list that you don't need me for. And so she would be able to figure out, oh, okay, I can go do my piano, or I could go do my reader, or I could do math, or whatever. So she knew what she could do on her own and what she kind of needed me for. So I started with just a simple checklist. Then as she got a little older, and I became a little bit more anal, I created more of a schedule with times. And this was also for us to know, look, if you do all your work, you're going to be done with school by 2. And we would save, at bedtime, she would do her reader. Now, when the kids were younger, I saved the read-alouds for bedtime. But as they got older, I switched it to the read-aloud was going to be at 1:30, so it was after lunch, after we had done all of our big things. It was kind of a reward for me, because I also like to read. So that would be like okay, we can get on the couch, and we can do our read-aloud, and we can have some together time. It followed typing and piano, apparently, on Mondays. So I like to read myself to sleep, and so I was trying to teach my kids to read themselves to sleep. So as they became more proficient readers, then they would do their reader at bedtime so that they could read to themselves. And that would shorten our school day. They didn't have to get their reader done during the school day. They could do it at bedtime. So a little bit more formalized. And then once they got really into middle school, I really just let them work off of the instructor's guide. So this is the instructor's guide for level G, And really everything that is on here, they could do on their own. In theory, I have dyslexic kids. So I actually did do a lot of this myself in 6th grade because of the dyslexia. But if you don't have dyslexic kids, then they are quite capable of doing the Bible reading for themselves, the history reading for themselves, the reader reading for themselves, and really all you need to do is the read aloud. And we'll talk about that, why we still do a read aloud in middle school. And so then my job was to either check in with them and do the discussion questions that are found in the notes for the history stuff. So to kind of check in with comprehension, make sure that they had done their timeline and mapping activities. And then I would do the read aloud. But the reality was I was actually still doing a lot of the reading because of my dyslexic kids. So again, there's no right way, no wrong way. You do what works for you. Another thing that worked for us was to use a timer. So depending on the child, my daughter didn't like the timer as much because it would stress her out. But my sons, two boys, they were competitive. And so they loved to race the timer. So if it was math or something, I would say, okay, I'm going to set the timer for 15 minutes. Let's see how far you can get. Do you think you can finish in 15 minutes? Maybe you can get halfway through the page, depending on how much there was to do. And they would just be off, and I didn't need to be there because they were motivated by the timer. Once they became really middle school, especially into high school, using a planner was a great tool because especially by high school, they were involved in other things besides school. So it may have been a sport. My kids played soccer. It could have been piano lessons. It could be Bible study at youth group. So in order for them to learn how to manage their time, they would get a journal, a day timer, and they would fill in the monthly spread. So they would put in the things that they had to do. So if they were going on a mission trip, or if they had a game, an away game or whatever, they could put that on their monthly spread. And then on the weekly spread, they could fill in what their assignments were. It's so hard to do this backwards, you guys. So they could, each day, like, oh, I have soccer practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then I have a game on Friday, and have a game on Saturday, and I have piano on Monday. So when they filled in all of what they were doing, and oh my gosh, when they got a job, that was, now they're working on Tuesdays after school or whatever. So having that would show the pockets of time that were left, and that's when they had to do their schoolwork. So they had to fill in the pockets the time that they had. So that helped them to learn how to manage their time and get their work done. I really like to do that right around when they're tweens, maybe 12, 13, like they're starting to feel a little bit more independent. They want to be treated differently than their younger brothers and sisters. And so that was when I really let them just decide. Like before I had the checklist, and now it's like, okay, here's the instructor's guide. This is what you need to get done this week. I don't care if you sit and read all of your history in one day and you don't touch anything else. Maybe math they kind of had to do every day. But science and the Bible and the reader, all that kind of stuff. Like if you just want to sit and churn through all your history on Monday, that's okay with me. This is what needs to be done by the end of the week. You can manage your time however you want. These are the rewards, and these are the consequences if this doesn't happen. You know how you wanted to go to, with your friends to that football game Friday night? If all your work isn't done, you're not going to get to go. If all your work is done, absolutely, go, have a great time. So the rewards and consequences were important to know up front, because that was going to help motivate them to get their work done. And once they figured out how to do that, it wasn't a battle anymore. Like they just figured it out and got it done. And so once they got to college, they now could work independently. And college is not a 5 days a week class usually, unless it's a foreign language. And so they had to realize that if they had no classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that didn't mean that they got to go to the beach all day. That meant that they had to get their work done because they were going to be in class on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So they had to get their homework done on Tuesday, Thursday. And starting that at home helped them figure that part out. So those are my tips. I was gonna say, I also had a whiteboard. So I'm in my kitchen, and this wall right here used to have a ginormous whiteboard on it. So another year before I came up with the checklist, I would just write in wet erase marker. So if you use a wet erase marker on your whiteboard, then it won't erase unless it's wet. So if you use the vis-a-vis pens that come with your markable map, you could put the subjects and then use a dry erase marker to check things off. So again, just a visual, like these are the things we need to work through. You're not done until those things are checked off. Don't ask me to go outside and play until these things are checked off. And so I think another thing too is consistency. Like if you just stick to your guns, this is how it's gonna be, then kids won't try to, they're kids, they're still gonna try, but they won't try as often to get away with things because this is how it's going to be. This is what needs to be done. And so just be consistent with those things. Also, another thing, we have a saying around here, what's praised is repeated. So if you praise your children for doing a good job, for working independently, then they're going to want to do that more because it's getting them a positive response versus if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, they may get a negative response, like an unhappy mom. So those were my biggest tricks and tips for fostering independence. I don't expect my 8-year-old to be able to work a calendar or read the instructor's guide unless I say, go to the instructor's guide and see what pages you're supposed to read on your reader. And that's it. I don't expect her to be able to work the entire matrix on her own. But as they get older, they certainly can. So those are my tricks about that. Any questions? I see quite a few of you have joined. So if you have any questions about any of that stuff, feel free to drop it in the chat and I will answer them. I'm going to now segue into readers versus reading aloud. But you go ahead and ask if you guys have a question about that. So readers and read-alouds. For those of you who are relatively new to Sonlight, you may not know that we schedule read-alouds up through middle school. And you think, well, hang on a minute, my kid's in 3rd grade and he can read. Why do I have to keep reading to him in 4th grade and 5th grade and 6th grade and 7th grade and 8th grade? Like that's a lot of years when I don't need to be so involved and I can give my kid the book. I can look at this book and say, my kid can read this. Why do I have to read it to him? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons and I'm gonna go through those real quick. I actually grabbed I looked on my shelves and I grabbed a couple of books and I'm gonna read aloud to you and I'm gonna show you some of the things I mean. So first of all, reading aloud is quality time together. So think about it. When you were younger and you would go on a date, I know you didn't go on a date you wouldn't go on a date and read aloud to one another, but you might go to a movie together. And so you're sitting side by side watching the same thing, and then afterwards you might talk about the movie. Oh good, I'm so glad that's been helpful. Yay. So when you go to a movie, you know, afterwards you're gonna talk about it. It's an experience that you've done together. And that's basically the same thing that you're doing with your kids with read aloud time. You are reading it with them, you're reading it aloud, you can stop and talk about things. It's an experience. It's a shared experience together. It is quality time together. So kids want to be read to. They want your time. Even middle schoolers, I know. It seems like they don't, but they really do. Trust me with this. So we have so many inside jokes and family lingo that stemmed from read aloud books that we did. One is the Goonie Bird book. We discovered Goonie Bird before Sonlight even started carrying it, and there's more than one Goonie Bird. Like I think there's 5. So we listened on audio. I didn't read it, but we got the CD and we would listen to it together. And in that book, for those of you who have read it, you know that Goonie Bird teaches the class to throw in a word like suddenly. And now that word, suddenly, has become part of our lingo. Anytime we see the word suddenly, that's how we do it. Just like that. Suddenly, with the eyes and the face and all that. It's kind of our inside joke. Another thing that has become part of my oldest son's vernacular is no sneaky partners. And that comes from the book Little Britches, where there's a scene in there where, well, I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but that phrase came from that book. And he was in college confessing to us something that I really didn't want to know. And he said, Mom, no sneaky partners. And I burst into tears. Like, that was a 5th grade level book, and he was in college, and it was still part of him. Like, it was still deep into the fabric of his soul. Another phrase that we will sometimes use is sailing by ash breeze, and that's a Nathaniel Bowditch quote. So things like that, like you read the books together and they become part of your family, they become part of your lingo, like it's just kind of who you become. Also, another reason that we read aloud, especially 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, the kids at that age, some of them are strong readers and can read Narnia or The Hobbit or whatever, and others are still kind of getting to the fluency stage. So there really is a reading gap between what they're capable of reading for themselves and what you read aloud to them. And the gap, like what is in there is vocabulary, sentence structure, vernacular. So it's more than just vocabulary, but it could be slang, it could be dialect. It's hard to read dialect, folks. It is hard to read it. So a child may have a hard time reading a book that has a lot of that in there. And I have an example. The Door in the Wall. This was a level C book. I don't know where it is now. This is my old copy, and it was level C when I read it to my kids. And I'm going to read to you from The Door in the Wall. And I'm not professional read alouder, okay? This is just, I'm just putting it out there. When they reached the stream, Brother Luke said, "'Tis best for thee to go into the water as always, so off with thy clothes, Master Robin." "But it is cold, and flesh creeps at the thought of it," said Robin, shivering. "Come, my son, doth thy father stop to say, 'I cannot go into battle for my king, because arrows are sharp'? Off with thy clothes, I say, else thou'lt lose the strength and skill thou hast begun to have. 'Tis a long way from freezing." And it goes on. So you get the idea. There's lots of these and thous and shouts and things like that. So that can be hard. It's hard for me to read. Can you imagine a child trying to read it on their own? But then there's stuff like, "But it is cold and flesh creeps." What does that mean? Well, it's goosebumps, but they may not even know the word goosebumps. So you have to stop and explain and describe or just ask, "Do you know what flesh creeps means?" And if they understand, then they can explain it. And if not, then you can explain it. So that's not a vocabulary word. That would be vernacular or an idiomatic expression. So that's level C. And you see, it's not a hard book. Like a 3rd grader may be able to pick this up and read it. In theory, there's pictures. It's not like it's The Hobbit, but there's something in here that, requires a little more, a little extra. So, So there's that reading gap. Recently, I'm in a book club, and I picked Pride and Prejudice as our book club read because it had been a long time since I had read that book, and so I wanted to discuss it with my friends, but I wanted to do a fresh reread. And I listened to it on audio because I was having a hard time with the 1800s writing. And the narrator just did it beautifully, and I could understand it so much better. I don't speak British English. I don't speak 18th century British English. I am not a King James Version girl, so I'm not exposed to that a lot. And so I just enjoyed it so much more having it read to me. And so it's the same kind of idea when you are reading it to your child. It also increases fluency. So when you are reading aloud to your child, they hear the way it's supposed to be read. You pause at the commas. You stop at the periods. You intone things differently when it is spoken phrases as opposed to just text. You pronounce things correctly. I'll never forget the first time I heard the word melancholy said correctly. In my head, I would read it melancholy. And that's how I said it in my head. And then I heard someone say melancholy, and I was like, that's what that word is? Melancholy? So you pronounce things the correct way, hopefully. And even if you don't, even if you're reading, a story that takes place in, here, I have Daughter of the Mountain. There are lots of names in here that I can't pronounce. I'm not from Tibet, and so I have a hard time, but I still try. So I'm going to read this little bit to you. So this is the story of a little girl whose dog gets stolen, and she goes in pursuit of it off the mountain. She lives very high in the Himalayas, and so she's coming down off the mountain. That was Pempa, my dog, said Momo. The man stole him out of my house, and I'm going to get him back. Both women left their work at the stove and came to where Momo stood by the door. Who are you? Asked the older woman, the mother of the household. I am Momo, and I live near the top of the Jelapla Pass. My father is the dock runner who carries the mails from our village of Longram to Kapup and sleeps there at night, and then next day returns to Longram. Send word to him, please, by the mail carriers who go on from here, that I am well and will come home when I have got my Pempa back. And then skipping ahead. But child, you don't understand. You will walk for days up and down the mountains, and then down into the valleys, up and down, and every time the valleys will be hotter and the air more steaming. You will come to a land where no one will understand what you say, and then you will come to a very large town with a huge bazaar. That is Kalimpong. And from near there, a great thing called the terrain takes all the wool and the people who want to go down to the plains of India, and it rushes down the hills as fast as the waters in spring when the snow is melting. But no one can set foot upon that terrain without the paying of much money, and you have no money. So the terrain is a train. And so in this story, when I was reading aloud to my kids, it was a little scary. This girl is going after her dog by herself, and she's young. I want to say she's like 8 or 9. So she's alone on a mountain with bad guys all around. I mean, it's scary. And so I wanted to be present for my kids. This was a level F book. We read it when my kids were in 5th grade and third grade. I had a younger one following along. And it was a scary concept. And so I wanted to be there. I wanted to be present to reassure them that it was going to be okay, and to answer any questions. So sometimes a story is great, but maybe there's a lot of emotion, or there's a lot of activity that might be disturbing, distressing for a younger child. Remember, we're reading above the level that they would be able to read on their own. And so some of the things that they are reading about, or you're reading about, can be a little emotionally charged. And so you want to be physically present with them to reassure, answer questions, explain, that kind of thing. Sometimes a book can be controversial. I don't know if you've heard of The Witch of Blackbird Pond, but a lot of people hear the word witch and they're like, we're not going to read that book. Spoiler alert, there is no witch. Let me read to you from this book. I stopped to see Hannah Tupper. She said the name deliberately and was rewarded by his startled eyes. The widow Tupper? Does your family know about that kit? Judith and Mercy know. Hannah is a good friend of mine. She's a Quaker. Does that matter? Yes, I think it does, he said thoughtfully. Not that I hold anything against the Quakers, but this woman has no proper reputation. She's been accused twice of practicing witchcraft. That's just cruel gossip. Probably, but I'd hate to see it turned against you too. You know, Kit, there are a few people here in town who still haven't forgotten that day you jumped into the river. If they find out that you're acquainted with a witch, John, how can you pay any attention to anything so silly? So, again, there's some stuff in here that it can lead you down some really good conversations. Like, just because the gossip says one thing doesn't mean you have to go along with the gossip, and you have to do what you feel is right. Like, there's so many conversations that you can have, but you're not going to have them if you aren't reading aloud to them. Good. I'm glad to see some of you really enjoy this book because it's a great book. So that's another one. And then talking about vernacular, I pulled out, this is so hard, Moccasin Trail. I'm not going to be able to read this one because it is tricky, but you're going to hear it anyway. So this is a story about some kids whose parents have died, so they're alone, and the older brother has been living with the Crow Indians. And so he finds out that the kids are alone, and he comes back to help them. And there's a lot of dialect. James, what happened to Uncle? He got scalped. It sounded blunter than he'd intended, but every time she called him James, it rattled him. Hurriedly, he added, I didn't feel nothing, or he didn't feel nothing. He had an error in his brain. His awkward attempt to smooth things over took the remaining color from Sally's cheeks. Injuns, she said. My stars, I can't see how... She stopped abruptly, drawing a long breath. Johnny says you're going to go clear to the valley with us and claim our land. That's the ID, I reckon. We lost the old farm. Did you know that? Not till today. She looked at him a moment, clearly stifling a dozen questions she didn't dare ask. You sure been gone a long time, she murmured resentfully. And then it goes on. So, words like A-R-R-E-R, arrow, error, and idea, I-D-E-E. So it is hard to read some of this. It's okay if you stumble through it like I was, because your kids are going to stumble through it. And so you are setting the example that it's okay. Katie said you had a huge conversation about prejudices and assumptions versus what was reality. Yeah, exactly. And it's harder to have that conversation if they're reading it on their own and then you're coming back and asking. So when you have the questions in the reader's guide, those are mostly testing comprehension, like are they actually reading it? Do they understand what they're reading? Are they getting the major plot points? But those deeper conversations usually stem from the read-alouds. And so for that reason, you read aloud all the way through middle school. It's not till level 100 that now you just have literature and the kids can read on their own. And spoiler alert, I read to my high schoolers because, again, I have dyslexic kids. And I joked with my daughter that I was going to go to college with her because I was going to have to read her textbooks to her. And then she finally figured it out. So for all those reasons, time together, quality time, increased fluency, conversations that it leads you down. It requires deeper understanding. There's like the thing below the thing, and emotionally charged, you want to be present for all those reasons. We have read-alouds in middle school. You guys have a great day. Bye-bye.